Welcome to another edition of Smalltalk for You. This morning I wanted to continue with the Seaside tutorial in VA and take a look at our login component. What we're doing this morning is adding the usage of the custom session we created last time with the login component. Now there's a little bit of a difference in the way VA does this than other Smalltalks because VA doesn't have full support for continuations. Now in the past with Seaside this was kind of a handicap, but in the latest versions it's not really so much of a problem, and I'll show you why. Let's go in here. What we're doing with our login component, which is a subclass of WA component, is we're initializing it to hold a user, and this is going to be the user that we've created. And you notice that in our workspace we've gone ahead and created a user, Fred Flintstone, so that we have somebody who can log in. And what we're going to do is in the rendering we're going to set all that up. So we have here our div and we have our class login, so that again we can have CSS to make this render nicely. Set up a paragraph with rendering the username, password, and the render buttons. So we have an input field for username, password, and our buttons. And you know, the username and password is going to look awfully similar, except that the password has this password input so that we can hide that with asterisks, and username is going to look very similar. And again, notice this, text input on username of self-user. So what it's going to assume is that you're going to take the username and store it into a variable called username in the user object. So we have a user object that's going to respond to this. So again, very nice setup, mapping data into your domain, so you can do this very cleanly, kind of the way you do in a GUI application that's not web. Now let's go to render buttons on. This is where the interesting thing happens. It's a little different than most Seaside. In most classic Seaside applications, you'd have a call reference here, but notice what we're doing. We have a callback to self-validate login, and that's where we're taking the path of pressing the submit button and logging in, which would eventually take us to our post editor, which we haven't written yet. And then finally we have callback here, server new on answer. So we have show on answer instead of call. And that's because VA doesn't have full support for callbacks using call. What we do instead is the show on answer, which doesn't wait for the answer to come back. What it'll instead do is run this block when the answer comes back from the previous thing, so that you can do whatever it is you're supposed to do. Now, VA may support call at some point in the future. It doesn't now, but you can do much the same thing using this approach and have applications that look very similar, but instead use this pattern. And you're going to write this kind of code a lot. So let's go ahead and see how this looks. Validate login we'll take a look at real quick. You just go ahead and check the username and password. If you got one, you set the session up with the current user and then show the blog server view on new answer again. We're doing this instead of call. So we're just going straight into the server view. Eventually when we have a post editor, if the user logs in, we're going to actually show that instead, or at least a link to it. We haven't gotten that far yet, so we're not doing anything terribly exciting here except caching the user. So let's go ahead and see how that works. We'll go into login, and what we'll do here is we'll hit cancel, and that takes us here. So let's go back to login, and this time what we'll do is we'll go ahead and put in Fred Flintstone, and we'll hit login. And again, we go the same place because the logic's going to work the same way either way. In this particular case, we haven't done anything special yet, but you notice it all works. And if you were trying to use call in this method here, render buttons on, you would have noticed an exception pop up. And this is what you have to keep in mind when you're using VA and Seaside together. You have to use this pattern, which is not continuation based, instead, but it works just fine and allows you to write code that's otherwise identical to Seaside on any other platform. So this is really the only small refactoring you have to do as you try to migrate examples from, say, Seaside using Pharaoh to Seaside using VA. So that's about it for today. Until next time, have fun with whatever Smalltalk you're using.